Buenas tardes a todos. Gracias por estar aquí nuevamente en el segundo día de actividades en la jornada vespertina del quinto Congreso Internacional del Hábitat y Sustentabilidad, Futuros Posibles más allá del 2030. Agradecemos a los que se van incorporando y vamos a tener en este momento, tengo el honor de presentar a Merata Kawharu, quien impartirá la conferencia titulada Bridging Food Sovereignty, Indigenous People and Urbanization Insights from New Zealand. Esta conferencia se va a llevar a cabo en inglés. Merata ha puesto muchas imágenes para que puedan escuchar. She told us that she's going to use a lot of images so that everyone can understand. And we are really excited to have your presentation, and we know that you traveled a lot to be with us today, so thank you very much. Merata Kawharu es doctora en Antropología Social por la Universidad de Oxford, una destacada especialista en desarrollo económico y cultural indígena. Su trayectoria incluye trabajos en proyectos de investigación sobre emprendimiento maorí, gestión de recursos y patrimonio cultural. Ha liderado múltiples investigaciones financiadas por el Marsden Fund y el Ministerio de Negocios, Innovación y Empleo de Nueva Zelanda. Además, ha sido profesora e investigadora en las universidades de Auckland y Otago. Actualmente se desempeña como Vicerrectora Adjunta para Asuntos Maoríes en la Universidad Lincoln y dirige Nukuroa Consulting, que es con un enfoque de sostenibilidad y fortalecimiento de comunidades indígenas. Demos una cálida bienvenida a Merata. So, thank you very much. We're going to have this presentation for about 35 to 40 minutes because she has to leave for the airport later. So, thank you very much.
Buenas tardes. ¿Cómo están? Lo siento, español, pero ahora estoy aprendiendo. In my language, and I think in your language, we have the same kind of vowels, a, e, I, o, u. So I don't expect you to remember a lot of my talk because it's in English. U words, I'll try and teach you now. It's how we say hola, so it's kia ora. So, kia ora. Kia ora. So I think my job today, though, is to try and keep you awake because you've had a lot of nice comida. It's 3 o'clock, everyone feels a bit sleepy. So I'm going to start my talk with a little bit of a story just to get you in to my talk. It's not going to be heavy detail. I want to keep it high level and tell you a bit about what we're doing in New Zealand. So thank you so much for the opportunity for me to speak with you today. It's a real privilege to be part of this hui, as we say, or this gathering. So let me begin somewhere in the future. It's a completely different era. Our grandchildren have actually just gone off to school. We're sitting on the porch. You and I are reflecting sustainability efforts. Not so much with a concern about the states of the environment, but actually about the progress we have made. Unlike, as we say, our tupuna or our ancestors, our forebears, we're not significantly concerned about a climate crisis or biodiversity loss or pollution, things like that. Rather, is this better? We're mostly concerned about how to fine-tune our programs and how to keep improving our environmental, biodiversity, financial, economic, and cultural well-being. We've made real gains. Things are actually going okay. At the heart of this imagined future is our shared intent to make a meaningful difference for our communities and to leave behind a legacy of hope and restoration for those to come. This kind of future seems pretty imaginary, idealistic, even utopian. Is it even possible to achieve? We, in a collective sense, won't know where we'll obviously be in 100 years or more, both in terms of environment and climate, community, and the health and our urban lives. But we do know that we're here now, standing in a moment where the choices that we make now and our leadership now truly matter. There's no corner of the world untouched by the themes of this Congress. We talk about the climate crisis, its drivers in the globalization of markets, extractive capitalism, and industrial expansion. We see the degradation of ecosystems and accelerating species loss, of course. We witness geopolitical instability, rising food costs, rising food insecurity, increased costs of living in general, and of course, can't get away from mentioning the tariffs. And at the same time, we see a surging demand for energy, and I think especially in this time of the AI-driven age. It's pretty easy to spiral into a discussion about loss and to focus on what isn't working. But I have just a few moments with you, and I don't want to really dwell too much on what's broken, and I'm going to pivot. So I'm going to jump in my, what we call waka, or my fast sailing vessel, and head to Aotearoa, New Zealand. Wait, where's my map? The insights I'll share from Aotearoa are rooted in food sovereignty and Indigenous resilience, but they speak to something much, much broader. It is the regeneration of sustainable economies, the revitalization of relationships between people and place, and the retrieval of narratives about food, land, belonging, and identity. What we are doing is ultimately a story of how Indigenous values can shape an economic enterprise to then seed many outcomes. And I'll get into this. I'm talking about the basics in life, like how can we focus on efforts to grow food, whole foods and ancestral lands, foods which are climate resilient? How can we motivate people in cities and towns to reconnect back to this food source, such as through online stores, and support their extended family back home, the foodscapes, and connect to them, to connect to that knowledge, and to connect to the ancestral homelands. And if all of this can happen, healthier lives, economic prosperity become real possibilities in communities which at home are still coming out of the long tail of colonisation. Our journey has been shaped by unique histories. The impacts of colonisation, land alienation, rapid urbanisation, I think, are shared experiences by Indigenous peoples, marginalised communities right across the globe. So in the context of this Congress on Habitat and Sustainability, the emergent entrepreneurial venture that I will explore with you that aims to address the kinds of historical, economic, and environmental challenges is called Pa to Plate. Pa simply means village or to touch. Plate is, well, the plate of our descendants, those that live away, particularly in the urban centres. And the idea is to bring food from the rural-based homelands to the descendants wherever they may live. It aims to, we've been doing this for about 6-7 years now, and it aims to be both a commercial enterprise and a social enterprise as well. But before I get into the logistics and how we've done Pa to Plate, as well as perhaps some of the challenges, just want to share a principle. There's many, but one in particular with you, that if there's anything out of this little talk that I hope perhaps you can take away, it is this idea of, it's a Māori word, but I'll get into it. It's called whakapapa. So, whakapapa is something that applies in any human environmental context. Papa is the term we use for simply layer or layering. It underpins our entire worldview, our understanding of the universe, time, relationships, and structure. You could say it's our strategic plan framework, but it is also much, much more than that. I will come back to it in a minute, but to set the frame for our Aotearoa story, I want to begin with the Māori whakatauki, or proverb that goes something like this. We walk backwards into the future, or in our language, kia whakatō muri te haere whakamua. We begin this way because it helps us get the framing right, the framing for anything we do today. When you say you're in a corporate or at a university, or you're dealing with anything that you want to put together a strategic plan, many strategic plans, I think, are very present, future focused. What we try to do is think of that, but firstly, the past and all the elements within the past, and I'm going to get into it, how that influences where we are now and where we want to go. So whakapapa helps us get the framing right. We look to the past to understand what has shaped the conditions we face today, how we might move forward with clarity and purpose. This perspective matters to us if we want to ask the right questions and arrive at the right kind of answers. And whakapapa is at the heart of this. It's about time past and time present. It's a structural framework of relationships between living things, between ourselves and our ancestors, and between people and the natural world. As a relational system, whakapapa is guided by principles of interconnectedness and reciprocity. It informs stewardship principles, environmental practices, and increasingly today, it also guides planning, law, accounting, scientific experimentation, data governance, AI development, many, many spheres of endeavour. Whakapapa is essentially a worldview of coexistence. Well, at least that's the theory. Today, like many colonised nations, much of this whakapapa-based knowledge, especially the knowledge of human environmental coexistence, has been disrupted or lost. For example, environmental indicators that once say the right time to plant or harvest, or fish even, most in our case have of that knowledge, that kind of knowledge has disappeared with older generations. And the other problem we face is most of our population, probably 90% of our population, have moved to urban centres, separated from that knowledge. Climate change also is altering ecological cues that disrupt long-held seasonal knowledge. So these are some of the realities that we're grappling with today. But there's still hope. We still can learn from the few remaining experts that we still have. They are very, very few in our communities, probably less than 1%, I'd say. But we also have rich public archives, fortunately. We had missionaries too. We had ethnographers from the 19th century and others that wrote down and recorded much of this customary knowledge and scientific knowledge. So we have archives, millions of pages actually. I can talk about that another time. But we also have tools like AI to help bring together multiple data sources, combining Indigenous environmental science with national environmental and climate data sets, for example, to support local monitoring, forecasting and planning. For generation, the land itself was our laboratory, and whakapapa was the research method of inquiry, where accountability to the environments was particularly important, obviously, because it ensured our survival. Indigenous scientists observed, tested and adapted, tracking seasonal changes, trialling planting and harvesting techniques, monitoring species behaviour, and building knowledge systems grounded in the evidence and experience. It was a system that worked and was framed by values like reciprocity, restrictions for some things, or non-restrictions, and many other kinds of concepts, which underpinned the symbiotic relationship and survival of humans and resources. AI can help us now reconnect and recompile this information, as I mentioned, to help us to identify patterns, detect change, and inform decisions that I think honour both the Indigenous and Western scientific traditions. That's a little bit about that. But one last thing to say about whakapapa. So it helps us to map what has happened and to imagine where we want to go. So essentially it gives us the context for setting direction. So if I was to go back to that proverb that I mentioned, walking into the future while facing the past, we have many layers of deeper meanings. So for example, it helps us really simply to understand what worked and why, what leadership was important, what worked, why, what didn't work and why, what leadership was strong, how risks were managed, and simply also what were the leadership values, what were important and what were employed. So all of these things, and I'm just skimming the surface, and more, were part of taking a whakapapa-based approach to an issue, to set the context for how to problem solve and to strategically think about future plans and pathways. So now I've given a brief idea of whakapapa. We can now talk about food and sustainability. Food is not just sustenance. Food is whakapapa. It holds layers of history. It carries stories, place-based knowledge, and interconnected relationships between people and land and the values I've mentioned. We can help map these dimensions in what we call a whakapapa matrix to help design a kind of food system suitable to the economic, environmental, climate, and social conditions of a population or a community. I'm not going to get into the words of the detail, but what I want to just briefly point out is, so you've got on this side here, for example, you're working with a community, pick a year, any year, talk to them and say in 1940, you've got different categories, say cultural category, environmental category, social, economic categories. What was important to you? What can you remember? You can give a ranking, maybe using a Likert scale, 1 to 10, importance, high importance, low risk, high risk. Compare it to now, same categories, and each of those sorts of things. Then past versus present, and then help with those perspectives think about the goals and objectives you might want to look at. There's a couple of different ways you could interpret the matrix as well. So this one, really simply, is just a trend indicator. Obviously, if you started off with in the past, you started off with, say, a score of 1, and that might be, you could have 10 people in your community, 100,000, any number. It's the average number you come up with. Back at a time of, say, 1920, 1940, and then now, the number is greater. Obviously, you've got a rapid rise, so that's going to then determine or shape what it is that you need to do. Similarly, with that second row there, gives you a different kind of outcome. Then you could do something else. You just use the scores from a combined risk perspective. So what happens when we look closely at our food system through this kind of lens? Is what we have in 2025 what we have in the past? The short answer is no. Until the mid-20th century, many Maori communities had thriving place-based food systems. But from about probably the 1930s, 1940s, there was mass migration to the cities, mainly in search of work, because the lands in the rural communities were drastically reduced, and it was very difficult to survive from the land anymore. So people moved away from their food environment, their ancestral landscapes, and into these towns, cities. I think I mentioned around 90%, probably even a little more than that now, of the Māori population live in the cities, and many therefore are disconnected from the lands that once sustained them. But I think this is a story not unique to our country. We see it amongst First Nations around the world, Canada, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in Australia, Native American communities, of course, and then down here to Mexico and further south. So when people are disconnected from land, food sovereignty in its broadest sense is lost. When Indigenous food systems break down, communities often become dependent on supermarket supply chains, which of course includes cheap, ultra-processed foods. It's no coincidence that we see high rates of type 2 diabetes, obesity, and food insecurity in our communities at home, I think, as well as other places amongst Indigenous communities worldwide. Processed, high sugar, low nutritious foods are all too common amongst our diets. Urbanisation has created an illusion of convenience and satisfaction where food is abundant, but often stripped of nutrition, let alone any cultural meaning. Wholesome whole foods or produce may be out of reach or expensive to many, and rather being the first into food baskets, they may be the last, and I know it's often dependent on budget. Unlike typical food enterprises that focus on open market sales, Pāra Plate is whakapapa driven. It's trying to address these kinds of complex issues.
It challenged the system by re-establishing a kin-centred food economy, reconnecting the descendants, those urban ones I mentioned, with the foods at home. Again, the whole drive or rationale is to encourage healthier lives to people on multiple levels, remembering their whakapapa trajectory and how they got to the situation in the first place. Our whakapapa is, in essence, also our complexity systems approach to problem solving. So I'll just show you a couple of photos here of some of the gardens. This is in the mid-north of the North Island in New Zealand. The idea really very, very simply is to strengthen connections between kai or food, kāinga or pā is the communities, and kōrero, all the stories and narratives. Kai, kāinga, kōrero. So at its heart, Pāta Plate is about feeding families first, as our growers have been telling us, nourishing Māori communities with food grown on their ancestral land. It works by supporting community-based growers to cultivate a range of produce. And it's not just, whole foods like sweet potatoes, what you can see there, but trying to figure out what is going to be climate resilient for the next generation or two. So that's where Western science can help us. And the next stage is to think about what our customary foods from forests and waterways are, to think back to some of that customary knowledge that is held, some berries from trees, and then integrating them into, say, jellies, jams, we call them, in some novel, interesting ways, which would be really cool. So the fresh food is first distributed to the local resident communities, then to Māori living in nearby districts, and finally to urban descendants. So it reconnects 3 layers or papa of Māori in society. So you can just see that there. So it's the rural communities. I think there's probably something like 780 of these kāinga, these communities. But we're working with a dozen or so in the mid-north. So the idea is to connect the families around those marae communities, those kāinga, then those that live a little bit further away from those kāinga, and then those into the cities. So it's more than just a food distribution model. It is a cultural and economic reclamation project. Food is narratives about its origins and connections to land, connecting consumers to their places of origin and heritage landscapes. So just a couple of quick thoughts around the idea of a circular value chain. So it's a business and values-driven enterprise. An issue now is that it either becomes not commercial enough to subsidise its social enterprise, or it becomes too commercially focused and loses its social and cultural intent. Because part of the cultural idea in Pāta Plate is to have the food that gets distributed out to the communities, to the whānau, the families, wherever they live, and connect them through the last part of the return part. So the return would be with the labour of the people, so those that live in the cities particularly, they have the opportunity to come back home and give labour to help with harvesting or cleaning the gardens or whatever, maybe even to return food scraps. But there's also an issue in trying to do both the cultural, promote the cultural values, and at the same time do the economic enterprise values. It's very difficult to actually get the balance thing right. I can talk about that later. It's not that straightforward. So I'll just give an example of one of the growers, what he's trying to do in relation to this sort of thing. Because there are nuances specific to each of the growers and regions and to the economics, to the seasons, among other things. With Rereata, this grower here in the north at Waimau, his idea is to try and get, you have sweet potato here? Yeah, it's a great delicacy for us. So what he did is start growing here in this garden, first time in about 40 years, which is amazing and really good to see, to then help his community come back and start the art of learning to grow again, using what we call the Maramataka or lunar calendar, which is a customary knowledge thing. But the challenge is, how do we get enough people to work that very large garden? How do we get the produce into transport into the urban centre of Auckland? It's about 3.5 hours away. And then to a urban marae community centre, and from there to another vehicle, and from there to all the different houses. What he wants to do is do it in a way that is affordable for those families who generally don't have much. So he wants to operate on the basis of what we call koha, which is just you give whatever you can afford. Who's going to pay for all of that? So that's tricky. But he also wants to have some of the people that live in Auckland, the relations, come back home to remind them where they're from. He needs help in the garden because it's big. So that's one of the two of the issues. But scaling back up, Pāta Plate is a solution to global problems. I think its lessons can be applicable to any community around the world who face similar challenges like food sovereignty, cultural erosion, social disconnection, and urbanisation. So here we are today. If we had to step back for a moment, we could imagine that food is not just something that we buy and consume with little thought. It can connect us to place and to each other. For us in Aotearoa, New Zealand at least, these are the basic ideas of Pāta Plate. We all live in a world faced by the same kinds of challenges: high costs of living, supposed high connection between each other, particularly through social media, but also disconnection. We increasingly have the desire, I think, to know where food comes from, where it's produced, and how it gets to your plate. Imagine if you knew these things and the stories about the foods connecting back to origin landscapes, and for many of us, home, or in a word, whakapapa. These are the challenges, but I think with courage and leadership, with partnerships and vision, and also tools like AI, I think what seems a bit impossible might one day become very possible. Gracias. Thank you.
Thank you, Merata. Vamos a dar ahora la bienvenida. Voy a dejarles su micrófono. Vamos ahora a darle la bienvenida a la doctora Caterina Rondoni, quien será quien haga la sesión de preguntas y respuestas y que recibirá las preguntas que le hagan llegar a través de los papelitos que tienen los voluntarios. Adelante, Caterina.
No, sí. Yeah. Thank you very much. It was really inspiring, and first of all, thank you to be here because it was a long journey, And we already met in Europe, now in South America, hopefully the next time in New Zealand. And I would like to ask you, I think that during this conference, we had the possibility to discuss a lot about which should be the role of the university in the improvement of the well-being of the territory and community. And I would like to ask you if do the university has a role in the spread of indigenous knowledge? What do you think, and what do you do from your perspective in New Zealand?
Kia ora. Gracias. Can you hear me off this one? Yeah. Are you guys still awake? Or do I have to do a haka? No, I'm not going to do a haka. Okay, very good question. Well, you had two, I think. Okay, I'll try and answer the first one, what the role of university is. And yes, good question. So I think very simply, I only can speak from my experience. I've had the opportunity to be involved and lead probably over 20 projects now, multidisciplinary projects, mostly in New Zealand, but some projects elsewhere as well. I think the job of universities very generally is to coordinate the diverse resources and disciplines to support the aspirations of Indigenous peoples, to help them to pursue their pathways for resilience economically, culturally, environmentally. That is our job. Our job is also to work to co-design and co-develop specific foci for what is important. I think it's easy in a way to come up with what we think solutions or projects can be in our offices, but we won't fully properly know until we go down to the ground. Yeah. I think that's in a nutshell.
Thank you.
You had a second question, or was that it?
From your perspective, if you want to tell us something about what you're doing in your university related to that. I've just had the opportunity to, we've just finished a 5-year project on kāinga, which is community climate resilience, actually, which I'll try and summarise it, help communities to identify what their key climate challenges were, and then how can we plan for the next 100 years, generally speaking, which meant giving them the tools. But firstly, we have to put together a plan. So 5 years of working with them to identify in key areas in relation to energy, relation to waterways, in relation to housing, forest, land. What are your challenges or risks, climate related, and what are the goals? So we had, biophysical scientists working with us, freshwater specialists working with us, many, many scientists. So that was a really good project, because when you 5 years is not long working with any communities. I think you would know this. You're barely getting started, and then you add things like COVID. And I think I've been fortunate because I have whakapapa connections to communities, but you still have to build trust. You'll have to figure out how to work well with them. And when you're bringing Western other scientists, or even me, they would say things like this to me, oh, just go ask your father. It was another academic. So I still had to build trust, working beside them in their rhythm, in their time scale too. So if I live at the other end of the country and I book a flight to have a meeting with them, 2 days before that meeting,
a community event happens or someone dies, that takes precedence and priority. You've got to reschedule. It takes time. University contracts have a schedule. Funding has a schedule. A community has a different schedule. The funding ends, the work always continues. So,
thank you. And in honor of to the time and related to time, I find particularly interesting the idea of looking backward to build the future. So maybe you can tell us a bit more what is what is related to this idea of looking in the past to build the future, and maybe we can close this discussion with this insight from you, so you can take your flight on time.
thank you. Yeah. Keeping it really simple, I think for any community, anywhere, they all have their own histories, and they all know how they got to where they've got to now. So I just emphasize for each community to understand what that trajectory is, economically, culturally, socially, those things, to help them design how to plan for their future. For us, it's simply around land loss. It's also around human capacity loss, and how do we want to build a resilient future with those two things. And then you add climate impacts, climate effects, and then we've got to figure out how to bring the best of Western tools, the best of Western technology with our own customary knowledge and ways and values to then plot the best pathways according to our whakapapa process.
Thank you. Thank you very much for being here. Big applause.
Thank you very much, Merata, and thank you, Caterina. Con esto cerramos las conferencias del día de hoy. Vamos ahora a bueno, se nos fueron, pero a darles un pequeño reconocimiento.